This program has been about a year and a half in the making. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge some of the people who helped make it happen. Ed Mogul here in the back of the room. Ed, if you want to wave, who actually had the original idea for this symposium. So thank you. Of course, Bob Clifford and Clifford Law for their generous financial support. And of course, Ivy Mosley, who's also in the back of the room. Ivy, if you wanna wave. Without Ivy, we'd probably be hungry, and we'd probably be having this event in the parking lot somewhere. So thank you. So we began planning this symposium in the wake of the Highland Park shootings in July of last year. And we felt some urgency at that time to put it on quickly while the sense of relevance is still high. Well, today, as we look to pass yet another grim milestone in our country's history, we have already surpassed the largest number of shootings in a single year. The issue remains as relevant as ever. And since I put the slide together on the 3rd of December, there have been anywhere from 3 to 7 more shootings, mass shootings, depending on how you count. The same questions tend to come up, right? In the aftermath of these events. We want to know, could we have seen this coming? We want to know what we can do individually, collectively, keep this type of senseless violence from happening again. And yet it seems that the public discourse around these issues is driven much more by politics and people's preconceived notions about guilt, innocence, culpability, human nature, causality, much more than data, than research data. So, and by the way, healthcare and legal professionals tend to carry a disproportionate amount of burden in fielding these questions, both professionally and among their family and friends. So what we wanted to do for this symposium is outline the current state of knowledge about what we know about mass attacks, which is what Dr. Alathari and Dr. Hamlin have so well done so far, but also equip you with a basic vocabulary that you can use to navigate these really tough conversations. So, one thing I think we can do right away is try to move this conversation out of the political space and into the public health space. In the current political environment, I think it helps diffuse the emotions and help us work on public health solutions for something that's essentially a social illness. So, what I'm going to do something is a little different. I'm not going to present any data. I think Dr. Hanlon presented some great data from our lab. But what I would like to do is talk about the science itself. I'll talk about the promise and limitations of behavioral science in understanding human behavior. And I'll give 2 examples, COVID-19 and suicide prevention, where it's actually been translated into policy successfully. And then we'll talk about the future, what we see for this research going forward. So we start with the premise that human behavior is incredibly at any given moment, what anyone is going to do is determined by a multitude of factors, some of which are intrapersonal, like personality, attitudes, some of which are motivations, environmental influences. Behavioral science is an empirical tool set that allows us to systematically study the multifactorial influences on human beings. The process from research question to translation is long, and it proceeds in 3 broad stages you see here. By the way, who can tell me the average time in years from research idea to translation to intervention. What do you think?
20 years.
All right, the pessimist here. You're not too far off. It's actually 17 years, according to the NIH, from research idea to intervention. So it's a long process. But there is a reason for that, and the reason is it's incredibly systematic. So we begin by having a common definition of the problem. And as you already saw from the two talks before, that in this field of mass attacks, we really don't even have a common definition yet of what we're studying, right? There is variability in what constitutes a mass attack in terms of the number of victims, 3 or 4. There's variability in whether or not to include firearms versus other weapons, whether to include public spaces, semi-public spaces. So we're still, I think, at the initial step of trying to work out a definition. By the way, the variance in definitions is the reason you see such vastly different prevalence estimates for mass shootings if you look online, right? That range from dozens to hundreds per year in the US. The reason for that is because different statistical databases use different definitions for what constitutes a mass attack. From definition, we proceed to measurement phase, which involves the identification and measurement of all the possible risk factors and protective factors for mass violence. All traits in nature follow a normal distribution with a mean that represents the average of the population and some predictable degree of deviation around that. Right? The larger the study sample is, the better it approximates the general population. And then provided that we measure our constructs well and we define our constructs well, we should be able to model just about any trait, any natural trait, including motivations, including abilities, environmental influences on behavior. The third and final step is the analytic stage. This is once we've gathered the data. And this is where we utilize complex statistical modeling to help us better understand the nature and strength of associations between different predisposing factors in our target behavior. So, for example, in this hypothetical model, we see that factor D is an important determinant of mass violence because it accounts for a large proportion of variance in that behavior. And we see that it's correlated with factor C. And if factor C is also a risk factor, then they might exert cumulative influence, or they might provide cumulative risk. And if factor C is a protective factor, then the factor C may buffer the effects of factor D. So that's kind of where we're going eventually with this type of research. I will give you just a couple of examples where this research has been successfully applied to public policy. And this is a now classic paper that was published in Nature in 2020, right? It's mid-2020, right after the pandemic closures. And this study looked at how human behavior impacts COVID transmission. One thing you'll notice in this model is that behavior is influenced by motivations, capacities, and environmental opportunities. And a lot of these relationships are bidirectional, to where, for example, motivation impacts behavior, and then behavior itself impacts motivation back in fact fashion. This is the final model from this study. And this study, by the way, helped inform a lot of COVID mitigation policies around the world. We can see that not only behavioral science can describe the pathways to a problematic outcome, this time infection, but also help identify the point along this multivariate pathway where mitigation measures would be most effective. And in this case, it was social distance. Remember the balcony parties? Probably a little more relevant to what we're doing here is now decades of research on suicidal behavior. This is the type of violence, of course, that's directed towards oneself, not others, but many risk factors we believe are shared. This is a review paper in the European Journal of Psychiatry that summarized several decades of research on suicidal behavior. Based on this work, and we're probably looking at about 4 to 5 decades of this research. But we now have identified a set of predisposing factors like history of abuse or head injury, and other predisposing factors that are mutable, like serotonin levels or poor emotion regulation. And we now understand that suicidal behavior proceeds in this predictable fashion from feelings of defeat and entrapment to contemplation to then execution. And that transition from one phase to the next is influenced by moderators like social exclusion or having a life crisis of some sort. This model has formed the basis for the US Surgeon General's approach to suicide prevention. It's a 2012 report that outlined the country's approach to suicide prevention. And so you see that risk and protective factors here act on the individual, which is nested in their immediate environment, which is nested in the community, which is nested in larger societal dynamics. And behavioral science research helps us identify the relationships between all these different levels. So a better understanding of the ways in which the likelihood of engaging in some harmful behavior is influenced by these individual and environmental pressures allows us to design interventions that address the mutable risk factors and boost the protective factors on all these levels, from individual to societal. One limitation of these designs that involve really complex synergistic interactions between multiple individual and environmental determinants is that they require huge sample sizes, typically in thousands of individuals, in order for us to be able to separate signal from noise, in all these super multivariate analyses. In fact, this is probably the biggest barrier at this point that stands in our way of applying this methodology to the study of mass violence at the present time. So what do I mean by that? Dr. Hanlon and Dr. Alpari touched on this a little bit, is that while mass violence kills many people, very few individuals in the general population actually commit mass attacks. So this is an example. This is a comparison between suicide and mass attacks. In 21, 1.7 individuals attempted suicide in the United States, which translates to a prevalence rate of about 512 individuals per 100,000. Still rare, but not as rare as mass attacks. Depending on how you measure what a mass attack is, there were anywhere from 12 to 689 completed mass attacks in 2020, which translates to a prevalence rate far smaller than one individual per 100,000. Of course, low frequency of mass murder in the general population is a good problem to have, right? But it does mean that we cannot yet apply the same methodology we use to study suicidal behavior, for example, to this problem. In the meantime, we've used two general research approaches that Dr. Alpari and Dr. Hanlon have outlined as first steps. These are called cross-sectional designs because they study a section of the population at one point. So first, we can systematically study retrospective case reports of these events and use descriptive statistics to understand the most common characteristics of individuals who commit these crimes. Secondly, we can use group comparisons to study significant differences between individuals who commit mass violence versus, for example, nonviolent offenders or community controls. These retrospective cross-sectional designs are the essential first step in behavioral research because they help us identify the potential risk and protective factors to be included in more complex models in the future. The downside of these designs, of course, and you've probably got that sense already from presentations we've had, is that while descriptive, many of these factors are not specific to mass attacks, right? For example, who can tell me one personal characteristic that carries the greatest associations with mass attacks today? And you two can say. What is the one personal characteristic?
Psychopathy.
Very nice. No, it's male gender. Right? Which is true, but also successfully describes nearly 50% of the US population and over 80% of violent criminals in general. By the way, contrary to what you might hear in the media, mental illness tends to be a really weak predictor of violence in general also, in that individuals carry a diagnosis of some mental health condition are not statistically more likely to commit a violent crime. In some studies, actually a little less likely, probably because of the treatment they receive. So now we look into the future. This is one example of how prospective research on mass violence might look like. By the way, this is the model we're currently using in our lab to study community violence in some Chicago neighborhoods. So in this model, mass violence is operationalized as a life event, right? Not a disease, not a condition, a life event, whose probability or potential is determined by the complex and dynamic interactions between all these different risk and protective factors. So the individual factors can be static, like history of trauma, cognitive abilities, for example, personality. Individual factors can be mutable or state dependent, like life crisis or violent ideation. And then the individual determinants are nested within the whole gamut of socio-ecological pressures, starting from the individual's proximal network of family and peers to community dynamics and supports, and extending all the way up to societal dynamics like access to deadly weapons or how violence is portrayed in media. So individual behavior is nested within all these different layers of risk and protective factors. As an individual moves through time, their relative risk of actually committing an act of violence continually fluctuates as a result of these dynamic interplay between risk and protective factors. And then a mass attack event precipitates when multiple risk factors combine in one time point and they outweigh the protective factors. So when we have large enough data sets, this allows us to study this phenomenon in this fashion. And then the interventions that come out of this research are able to address the most important risk factors and bolster the protective factors. So an individual's violence risk can still fluctuate as they go through time, but they never dip beyond the point of no return where they commit to the decision to go through with the harmful behavior. So this is where we're going. In reality, however, we're probably at least a decade from where we have sufficient sample sizes to reliably test these models. And then recall the 17-year time span between research and intervention. So realistically, we're probably several decades from where we have a comprehensive, evidence-based understanding of who's going to commit a violent or a mass attack. Yet I think we would all agree that we can't wait that long, because mass attacks are killing more people than ever before. This is another statistic from the Violence Project showing a kind of a steady increase in the number of victims of mass attacks ever since the federal assault weapons ban sunset in 2004. There was a spike in 2017 because of the Las Vegas shooting at a concert. So these are disheartening statistics for sure, but I think there's reason to feel hopeless. There is tangible action we can take both individually as a society. So one thing we can do is support continued scientific research into risk and protective factors, like the great work Dr. Latari is doing, for example. And while the science is evolving, we may wish to channel resources to harm reduction. If you work in healthcare like I do, you've probably seen this model many, many times. And this is a risk mitigation strategy that highlights the importance of both mitigating the hazard itself and minimizing the risk of exposure to the hazard. So then we can advocate for meaningful and straightforward harm reduction strategies, right? Like enhancing public safety protocols or restricting access to weapons, especially weapons that can kill a lot of people very, very quickly. While these harm mitigation efforts do little to help us understand who will go on to commit a mass attack, they do save lives. And this is, after all, I think why we all care about this issue in the first place. So I'll leave you with one final thought. We tend to regard mass attackers as sort of monsters who are unworthy of attention or understanding. And this attitude is certainly understandable. And it does serve, I think, an adaptive role in distancing ourselves from these horrific crimes. But it can also have a chilling effect on research and policy that help us better understand the motivations behind these attacks. So I think that one of the reasons all of us are probably here in this room is because we want to do something. We want to understand this issue better. We want to do something. So I think one thing we can do if we're looking for personal action is try to suspend judgment and prejudice and have a meaningful conversation around these issues. And events like this, I think, is a good first step. So next, we'll learn from Dr. Hoy Watkins about how this research is translated into practice, and then we'll have a conversation together.